The void stretched endlessly, an ocean of darkness punctuated only by the cold glow of distant stars. A silence as deep as eternity itself reigned across the cosmos, broken only by the hum of colossal warships slicing through the void with predatory precision. The Zarek, a species renowned across the galaxy for their ruthless efficiency and conquest, had arrived. Their empire, spanning hundreds of worlds, was built upon a foundation of destruction, subjugation, and the systematic extermination of any race that dared to resist them. Civilizations had fallen before them like dry leaves caught in a storm, their histories erased, their legacies turned to dust. Now, as their fleet loomed over an unsuspecting blue planet, another name was set to be added to the long list of the fallen. Inside the command bridge of the flagship Thavorthar, a chamber built from the ribbed exoskeletons of vanquished enemies, Zuktal, supreme warlord of the Zarek, stood motionless before a massive projection of the world. They were about to erase. His massive armored frame was a testament to the harsh evolution of his kind. His body was encased in thick, blackened chitin, segmented like a living fortress, his elongated skull ridged with bony protrusions that signified his station. His burning crimson eyes narrowed as they scanned the incoming data streams. The planet below was called Earth by its inhabitants. Their primitive world, weak, vulnerable, just another footnote in the grand campaign of Zarek dominance. Yet something gnawed at him, something he could not quite define. Report. His voice was deep, guttural, carrying the weight of command that had led to the demise of countless species. From the shadows of the command chamber, Vekar, the chief strategist, stepped forward. His elongated, almost spectral form, moving with the unnatural grace of a creature bred for intellect rather than combat. His grayish skin shimmered under the dim artificial light, and his multiple jointed fingers danced over the floating control panels as streams of information flickered before his three lidless eyes. "This world is indeed primitive by our standards," Vekar began, his voice a rasping whisper that coiled through the silence like a predator in the dark. "Their weapons are insignificant, their defenses laughable. However—" He hesitated, a pause so slight that it would have been imperceptible to anyone less attuned than Zuktal. "However what?" Zuktal's gaze sharpened. He despised hesitation. Vekar's fingers flexed, his three eyes flicking between various pieces of data. "They do not behave as expected." Zuktal's frown deepened. "Explain." Vekar tilted his head slightly, a habit he had developed from years of observing the subtleties of inferior species. All previous civilizations have reacted in predictable ways. They either fight with desperate futility or attempt negotiation, begging for mercy. These humans do neither. He gestured, and new footage appeared. Cities braced for war, their towering structures casting long shadows over the streets below. Massive human military forces had gathered, their primitive war machines lining the perimeters. Yet there was no panic, no signs of fear or desperation. Instead, they simply waited. The streets were not flooded with terrified masses. There were no frantic attempts at surrender. The humans had positioned themselves with eerie precision, their eyes lifted toward the sky as if watching, expecting something. Zuktal's mandibles tightened. "Are they waiting for us?" "It appears so." Vekar's fingers danced across the controls, zooming in on various locations across the globe. "They make no attempts at retreat. They do not try to contact us. They do not run." His voice dropped to an almost reverent hush. "They do not fear us." Silence fell over the chamber, a silence thicker than the void outside. It was unnatural. Every species feared the Zarek. It was the order of things, the very foundation upon which their empire was built. Fear was the precursor to victory, the fuel that drove lesser beings to surrender before the true battle even began. And yet, here was a species that did not tremble, did not cower, did not even acknowledge the inevitability of their doom. It was as if they knew something the Zarek did not. A cold realization slithered through Zuktal's mind, but he pushed it aside. This was nothing more than a peculiar anomaly, a minor inconsistency in an otherwise predictable campaign. He would not allow himself to be unsettled by the silence of an insignificant race. His eyes flashed with renewed determination as he turned sharply toward the assembled officers. "Prepare the fleet," he commanded, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. "We descend upon this world at once. This will be swift." Vekar hesitated for a fraction of a second before bowing his head. "As you command, Warlord." The command was relayed, and across the vast expanse of the invasion fleet, engines roared to life, their deep, resonant hum reverberating through the void like the drums of an approaching storm. The massive ships adjusted their trajectories, their sharp blade-like hulls angling downward as they began their descent into Earth's atmosphere. Fiery contrails slashed across the sky as the first waves of warships breached the heavens, their dark forms blotting out the sun. On the surface, the humans did not scatter. They did not scream. They did not pray. They simply watched. Zuktal, from the viewport of the Vorthar, watched them back, and for the first time in his long, blood-stained history, he felt something unfamiliar coiling at the edges of his mind. It was not fear. No, he had long since abandoned such weaknesses. But it was something, and it refused to be ignored. The sky above Earth was no longer its own. What had once been a vast expanse of blue, kissed by the golden hues of the sun, was now eclipsed by an iron-black armada. The Jarek ships, vast as mountains and jagged as obsidian blades, descended, like silent harbingers of doom. Their hulls reflected no light, absorbing the brightness of the world below, leaving behind only a suffocating darkness. The air itself seemed to tremble under the weight of their presence, as if the very atmosphere recoiled at the impending devastation. Yet, despite the overwhelming shadow stretching across the continents, Earth did not scream. Humanity did not run. They stood beneath the looming behemoths and watched. From the bridge of the Forcho Vorthar, Zuktal's piercing crimson gaze burned into the visuals before him, scanning the planet's surface, searching for the telltale signs of fear, of desperation, of the inevitable collapse of spirit that always preceded the fall of a lesser race. Yet no such signs emerged. The humans were there, standing in their cities, lining their streets, positioning their forces at key locations. They had mobilized, yes, but not in panic. Their formations were precise, their movements methodical. There were no swarming masses of refugees clogging the highways, no cries of surrender echoing through the global communication networks, no desperate transmissions pleading for mercy. It was as if they had expected this moment all along, as if they had been waiting. And that, more than any energy weapon or planetary defense system, disturbed him. As the first waves of Jarek landing vessels descended through the heavy clouds, their engines humming with the raw power of Interstellar dominance, the humans still did not move to fire. Even as the sleek jet-black war machines touched down in the heart of their cities, even as the towering figures of the Jarek warriors emerged in their nightmarish forms, armor plates shifting like living obsidian, mandibles clicking with readiness, clawed hands gripping weapons designed to reduce flesh and bone to smoldering vapor, the humans remained motionless. Then a figure stepped forward. In the heart of one of the largest human settlements, one the invaders identified as New York City, a man walked across the silent street, his boots clicking against the pavement as he approached the assembled ranks of Jarek warriors. He was unarmed, his stance relaxed but not careless. His uniform, a deep blue decorated with insignia that marked his rank and history, barely rustled in the cold wind sweeping through the abandoned avenues. His face, worn by years of war and responsibility, bore no expression of terror or despair. Instead, he regarded them with the quiet scrutiny of a seasoned strategist evaluating his opponent before the first move was made. Zuktal observed the scene from above, his mandibles tightening as the human halted mere meters from the towering Jarek soldiers. The warlord activated the bridge's audio systems, tapping into the relay that transmitted from the ground below. He wanted to hear this exchange. He needed to understand. The human, identified in their records as General Arthur Reynolds, let his gaze flick across the assembled alien warriors before finally speaking. His voice clear, unwavering, each syllable weighted with a confidence that should not exist in the face of inevitable annihilation. "So," he said, his lips curling in something that was neither quite amusement nor quite disdain, "are you going to kill us or just stand there looking ugly?" The Jarek warriors shifted uneasily. They were accustomed to fear, expected. It fed on it. But there was none to be found in this man's voice. No trembling, no pleading, no bargaining for survival. Just the measured tone of someone who had already calculated the odds and was unimpressed by them. One of the Jarek soldiers growled, lifting his weapon slightly. Reynolds didn't flinch. From the Envorther, Zuktal's eyes narrowed. He had seen many leaders break before him, had watched the mighty fall to their knees, weeping for their people, begging for another day of existence. But this one met death with nothing but a smirk. Reynolds took another step forward, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, tilting his head slightly as if considering something. Then, with a voice tinged with quiet amusement, he spoke again. "What's wrong?" he asked, his gaze locked onto the nearest Jarek warrior. "You look confused. Didn't your warlord tell you what happens when you invade Earth?" The Jarek hesitated. Reynolds' smirk widened, but there was something in his eyes, something colder, sharper. "We don't run," he continued, voice dropping to a near whisper. "We don't surrender." And then, just as the Jarek fleet's internal systems began to flicker, as error messages flooded their warship displays and communications blacked out across entire squadrons, General Arthur Reynolds took a slow, deliberate breath. And, most importantly, his voice was barely audible, but the weight behind it was undeniable. "We don't lose." The bridge of the Vorthar was no longer the stronghold of calm calculation and ruthless efficiency it had once been. The cold, sterile hum of the warship's systems was now disrupted by bursts of panicked voices, sharp clicks of claws, against metal as officers scrambled to make sense of the impossible. Zuktal stood rigid, his crimson eyes scanning the chaotic streams of data cascading across the holographic displays. Something was wrong, very wrong. The communications. "Grid is failing across the fleet." Vekar's voice cut through the discord, his elongated fingers dancing over the controls, in a desperate attempt to re-establish order. "Localized blackouts in multiple sectors. It's spreading faster than we can contain." "Impossible." Zuktal growled, his mandibles tightening with barely restrained fury. "No species we have encountered possesses technology capable of interfering with Jarek systems. And yet the evidence was undeniable. Warnings flooded the displays, power fluctuations in secondary weapon systems, sensor disruptions, rippling through the fleet like a contagion, entire divisions reporting erratic failures." Zuktal turned sharply toward his tacticians. "Is it sabotage? Do they have infiltrators?" Vekar's three eyes blinked rapidly, his body shifting in a nervous twitch. "No, this is not an external attack. This is internal. The systems are being overridden from within." His fingers curled in a motion of disbelief. "They're rewriting our protocols in real time." Zuktal's mind struggled to grasp the implications. No species had ever managed to access Jarek war systems, let alone manipulate them so effortlessly. Down on Earth, the humans had not fired a single weapon, had not launched a single missile, had not even attempted to breach the warships physically. And yet, their invasion was unraveling from the inside out. He turned his gaze back to the surface of the planet, where General Reynolds still stood, arms crossed, a small but knowing smirk playing at the edges of his lips. "You're wondering how we did it, aren't you?" Reynolds's voice came through the fractured comms, as if he had anticipated this very moment. "You thought our silence was weakness. You thought our stillness was submission. But all this time we were already inside your machines." Zuktal's claws clenched. A trap. This had been a trap from the very moment they had arrived in orbit. "Our species has spent centuries mastering war," Reynolds continued, his voice steady, unwavering. "We don't just fight with weapons, we fight with information, with deception, with patience." He took a step closer to the Jarek warriors still standing before him. They did not move. They did not react. They could feel it too. The unraveling of control. The end of certainty. "Now, let me ask you something," Reynolds said, tilting his head slightly. "How does it feel to stand on a battlefield where you've already lost?" Zuktal's rage burned hot, but beneath it, for the first time in his existence, something colder began to seep in. Doubt. The Mothra trembled, as if struck by an unseen force. Lights flickered, casting erratic shadows across the bridge as warning sirens blared through the corridors. Zuktal's claws dug into the metal railing as he watched the screens before him, each one flashing with failures that should have been impossible. The Jarek did not lose battles. They had crushed empires, silenced entire civilizations, rewritten the history of countless worlds in the blood of their inhabitants. And yet, here they were, being dismantled without a single shot fired. "Status report," Zuktal barked, his voice edged with a fury barely restrained. Vekar, his elongated fingers twitching over the failing control panels, struggled to maintain composure. "The fleet's main command relays are collapsing," he rasped. "Weapon systems are unresponsive. Shields are fluctuating across all major warships, even the propulsion units." He stopped, his three lidless eyes widening as he processed the newest incoming data. Zuktal turned sharply toward him. "What about the propulsion units?" Vekar's mandibles twitched in a motion of deep unease. "They are no longer under our control." The warlord's grip on the railing tightened, his armored fingers carving shallow grooves into the metal. "Explain," he growled. Vekar hesitated for the briefest moment, then spoke, his voice quiet, but laced with something that sent a chill through even the most hardened of warriors. "Our ships are moving, but not by our command. Someone else is controlling them." A cold, heavy silence fell over the bridge, broken only by the crackling interference running through their failing communication systems. The fleet, an armada designed to bring death and conquest to entire civilizations, was being turned against itself. And all because of one enemy, one species. Down on Earth. General Arthur Reynolds stood exactly where he had before, arms still crossed, watching, waiting. His confidence had not wavered, had not even so much as flickered. He was not stalling for time, he was not playing a bluff. He had already won, and he knew it. The radio crackled again. "You don't seem to be having a good time up there," Reynolds's voice came through, laced with an edge of dry amusement. "I get it. You're used to wars being simple. You arrive, you flex your strength, and your enemies kneel. The problem is," he tilted his head, his smirk widening, "we aren't your enemies, we're something much worse." Zukatal's eyes burned. "Enough of this," he snarled, slamming his fist against the nearest console, sending a spray of sparks into the air. "What have you done? So you came here thinking you were the apex predator," Reynolds continued, unfazed, "that we were just another species on your long list of conquests. But let me ask you something, Warlord." Zuktal's claws flexed involuntarily, his instincts screaming at him, telling him that he was already standing on the precipice of something he could not control. "Have you ever considered," Reynolds said, his voice calm, steady, inescapable, "that maybe you weren't the hunters this time?" The bridge shook violently. Zuktal barely had time to react before alarms flared across the remaining functional monitors. The warships, his warships, were turning. Their formations broke apart as their engines roared to life, maneuvering without command input, shifting position in a coordinated, unnatural dance. A new screen lit up before him, displaying what should have been a tactical report. Instead, a single line of text appeared, written in the Jarek language. "We control the battlefield." Zuktal's breath caught for the first time in his life. "This is not possible," he muttered. "This is not possible." Reynolds' voice cut through the static. "You underestimated us. You thought the war would be fought in the skies, with fire and blood, but you never thought to look at the battlefield you were actually standing on." Zukatal's mind raced. The battlefield. The war had never been about ships, weapons, or sheer force. It had been about control. It had been about deception. The humans had seen this battle coming long before the Jarek had even set foot in their star system, and they had laid their traps not on the ground, but inside the very systems, the key. Jarek relied upon to wage war. Vekar's voice shook as he whispered, "We were compromised before we ever arrived." Zuktal turned toward him, his rage giving way to something else, something colder. "No," he said slowly, realization sinking like a stone in his chest. "We were defeated before we even knew we were at war." Outside, the Dvorthar shuddered as its engines were forcibly rerouted. All across the fleet, the ships once destined to rain destruction upon Earth were now caught in an unseen web, tangled in a war they had never prepared for. Reynolds exhaled, glancing up at the blackened sky, where the armada above trembled under its own power. "You wanted to make history today," he mused. "Well, congratulations. You just did." Zuktal turned his gaze back to the planet below. He had crushed 1,000 worlds, broken 1,000 races, and yet this one had beaten him without ever firing a weapon. His claws curled into a tight fist, his armor plates shifting as the full weight of the truth bore down on him. The Jarek were not invincible, and now they knew it. The Purvothargis was no longer a warship, it was a prison. Zuktal stood motionless at the center of the failing command bridge, surrounded by flickering lights and the eerie hum of systems that no longer obeyed his will. His fleet, his unstoppable force of conquest, had been reduced to a helpless assembly of floating husks, their weapons silenced, their engines hijacked, their communications severed. The void which had once been his domain now felt suffocating. For the first time in his existence, he understood what it meant to be powerless. The silence was broken by the crackling of the fractured comms. "I assume you're starting to realize—" "What's happened?" came the voice of General Arthur Reynolds, smooth, unwavering, devoid of any malice or gloating. It was the voice of someone who had already won and felt no need to rub salt in the wound. "This isn't a battle anymore. It never was. It's an eviction." Zuktal's mandibles clenched so tightly that the plates along his jaw audibly scraped against each other. His claws curled into a fist, the heavy plates of his armor shifting with the movement. "You have gained nothing," he snarled, his voice carrying a desperate edge of defiance. "This changes nothing. We will return." There was a pause on the other end. Then Reynolds sighed as if speaking to a stubborn child. "No, you won't," the general said. "You still don't get it, do you?" The displays in front of Zuktal shifted, flickering with new data. For a fleeting moment he thought his crew had regained control, but then he saw what was appearing on the screens. It wasn't Jarek battle systems, it was human data. Tactical maps, coordinates, projections. For a species that the Jarek had deemed primitive, the complexity of the data was staggering. Then the realization struck him like a physical blow. They had known. The humans had known about the Jarek long before their arrival. They had studied them, dissected their strategies, anticipated every possible scenario. The invasion had never been a surprise. It had been expected, planned for, countered. "You've been at war with us for years," Zuktal muttered, barely above a whisper. "Decades," Reynolds corrected. "The moment we detected your kind beyond our system, we knew what was coming, and we prepared. Not with fleets, not with weapons, with something much harder to fight against. A battlefield you never even considered." As Zuktal's mind reeled, the Jarek had fought countless enemies, conquered worlds rich with resources, crushed empires far more advanced than this one. But never had they encountered an enemy that had already won before the first shot was fired. You manipulated our systems before we even arrived," he breathed. "Not quite," Reynolds replied. "We simply let you plug into ours." Zuktal's eyes widened. The humans had allowed scifi, the Jarek, to tap into their networks, infiltrate their systems, thinking they were gaining intelligence, when in reality they had walked straight into a digital minefield. Every communication relay, every intercepted transmission, every minor system breach had been engineered to feed them false confidence while the real battle was already being fought, not in space, but in the very code that held the fleet together. "You wanted to teach us fear," Reynolds continued, "but tell me, Warlord, what do you think fear truly is?" Zuktal was silent. "It's not the sight of an enemy's weapons," Reynolds said, "not the firepower of their armies. It's not even the certainty of death. True fear is when you realize that everything you believed in, Everything you thought made you powerful was never real to begin with. That's what you're feeling now, isn't it? The words cut deeper than any weapon. Zukatal had faced many things on the battlefield: resistance, rage, desperation, but never this: doubt. The bridge trembled once more, but this time it wasn't from weapons fire or system failures. It was the fleet, moving. Against their will. Reynolds exhaled. Your ships are being sent back. Your entire armada is already turning, away from Earth. By the time you regain full control, you'll be far from this system, and I suggest you don't come back. Are you would simply let us leave? Zukatal asked, his voice barely above a growl. That's the thing about humans, Reynolds said. We don't kill if we don't have to. We don't need to exterminate you to win. There was a pause. But if you ever come back, I won't be giving this speech twice. The comms cut out. Zukatal stood there, his mind unable to fully process what had just happened. Around him, the crew remained frozen, as if movement itself would confirm the reality of their failure. The bridge was quiet save for the hum of systems slowly rebooting under new, unfamiliar command. He turned toward the main viewport, staring into the abyss of space, watching as his mighty fleet, his once unstoppable force, was retreating. Not from war, not from superior firepower, but from something much worse. Defeat. For generations, the Jarek had whispered the same words to one another before battle, a phrase ingrained in their culture, their empire, their way of life. We do not fear. But now, as the stars blurred past and Earth grew distant behind them, a new phrase burned itself into Zukatal's mind, a truth far more terrifying than anything he had ever known. We don't kill humans. Because now they understood. They had never figured out how.